Endeavor 5185 Air
These
Center
students are
Center.
studying air traffic control.
A controller needs to memorize every point on that map and every point on this radar display.
It's a lot of information, and at first when you try and do it, it's really, really daunting.
It's part of a new program from the Federal Aviation Administration to fast-track students into a job in air traffic control.
And so any graduate of that program, instead of going through the academy, they can be hired into the agency.
Air traffic controller is at an all-time low in staffing. Now it's hit to a critical point where this can't be sustained. We currently have 10,800 certified professional controllers.
Yeah, I feel like this has been in the news recently, especially following some of those crashes and incidents with air traffic in the past. And so there was a lot of attention to the air traffic controllers, and that I think in some of those scenarios, the assumption was due to understaffing, et cetera, that the controllers were the reason for those issues. I think for some of the scenarios that I'm thinking of, I think it was later found out that that wasn't the case. But I think due to the short-handedness of a lot of airlines and control stations, that this got a lot of attention because it seemed like such an obvious potential issue where if you don't have enough staffing for air traffic control, then issues are likely going to happen more frequently. And so this does seem timely here. I think this has been something that we've seen, especially in the aerospace market, where planes and flights kind of dipped down in COVID, and so they chose to basically cut everything as much as possible. There wasn't as many flights going out, and so I assume air traffic controllers likely followed suit as well, where there wasn't as great of a need, and so they probably cut back or allowed their staffing to get a little short. And now that flights and things are starting to come back and have returned with the economy following COVID, though we'll see with how things go with future inflation, potential recessions, or other market instability, whether that trend will stay true. But at least as of this moment, flights are back in a healthy state, and so they still need to rehire into some of these niche jobs and roles that are necessary to keep air traffic healthy.
Where we need 14,633.
That's roughly a deficit of 26%. The shortage is not new and has been around similar levels for the last decade. But recent events, despite not necessarily errors of air traffic control, are calling more attention to the importance of filling these jobs.
The investigation continues into that deadly collision between an American Airlines jet and a Black Hawk helicopter near Reagan National Airport.
Air traffic control tower staffing deemed not normal.
Yeah, this is exactly what I was referencing, which is, especially in the early days of this, they were really highlighting the staffing scenario, and they were even highlighting how somebody left work 30 minutes earlier, an hour earlier, whatever it was, and that it seemed like they were really trying to push the blame onto air traffic control at that time. I think it was later found out that that was not the issue. It was more related with one of the pilots and the scenario for what they were choosing to fly under. Not necessarily the traffic controller themselves, but this got so much attention because it seemed like such a obvious issue right off the bat when they started to investigate.
But it's not deemed unsafe under FAA guidelines.
The NTSB said there was one person handling helicopter and airline traffic, when typically there would be one for each. The Federal Aviation Administration has limited flights in congested areas like New York because the number of controllers are insufficient.
On blue sky days last year, so days with no weather in the system, 68% of our delays were because of air traffic control restrictions. We have a delay in New York every single day, no matter what the weather is, because they're simply understaffed.
Another concern is the aging systems used by the FAA.
We have computers, and I kid you not, today in 2025 that are based on Windows 95 and floppy disks.
After an outage in 2023 that grounded thousands of flights, the FAA determined that 51 of its 138 systems that provide things like communications are unsustainable and need to be modernized. CNBC explores how the FAA got so behind on hiring air traffic controllers and technology, and what it's doing to fix it. The air traffic control shortage has been a concern for decades.
We know that the Federal Aviation Administration is facing a shortage of experienced air traffic controllers, and we cannot afford to ignore the safety needs of the aviation system.
It's been a long stemming problem. It's not just one thing, it's been multiple things over a decade. We've been having staffing numbers reported incorrectly. There haven't been hiring goals that have been met.
The FAA Academy in Oklahoma City is where the majority of ATC workers do their initial stages of training.
During the COVID shutdown, it stopped the entire Oklahoma City Academy. Some of them don't come back because they don't have a job at that point and are not getting paid. And we lost 500 trainees in 1 year because of it.
But just getting into the academy can be difficult. The FAA has strict requirements for who can apply. You can't be over the age of 30 unless you have prior experience, which raises the limit to 35. You must speak English clearly, pass the Air Traffic Controller Specialist Skills Assessment Battery Pre-Employment Test, also known as ATSA. You must also pass an annual medical exam. If you have high blood pressure or diabetes, you cannot be an air traffic controller.
It's a stressful job. It's rigorous. The training at the academy is rigorous, depending on which option you go through. Over the last 8 years, we've had 146,000 applicants, and we've hired 7,905 of those. So less than 10% of the people that apply for the job actually make it to the academy and then graduate to go out into the field.
Many applicants also drop out before they reach the end of their training.
So last year in FY24, our goal was 1,800 controllers. We hired 1,814 of folks that will go through the academy, but we'll lose 35% of those at the academy. We'll lose another 20% once they get in the field on the job training. So we don't net 1,800 controllers. Traditionally, people will get through the maps, they'll get through the written test, and it's when they get into the simulation and the actual practicality of the job that we lose most people.
The interest starts out high, and then as you see the stresses, the pressure, the continuous learning, the millions of decisions that you have to make every day, and you have to be perfect. So that begins to.
Yeah, this seems like a likely thankless job. While in those scenarios they mentioned earlier, people were very quick to point blame at air traffic controllers. They even highlighted this like delay scenario where they're blaming air traffic controllers for delaying all these flights, even when weather conditions are good. However, I don't think I've ever heard of a positive story about air traffic controllers, of like how, generally speaking, there aren't that many issues with air traffic, and crashes and collisions and other incidents are relatively low, like some of the lowest in basically any transportation medium. And so it seems like basically if you do your job well, you go unseen, unheard, and then if you mess up, or even if somebody messes up near you, you're the first one to take the blame. And so I'm not sure if these people are getting paid all that well to make up for that type of stress, responsibility, and also kind of the blame that they're going to get at this. So that does add up to make a lot of sense to me that people wouldn't want to do this job. So maybe they'll share what their actual salaries are like, but I wouldn't assume that they make all that well of money, but maybe I'm mistaken.
To attract people as time goes on.
Additional challenges include the mandatory retirement age of 56. Wages and hours are also something to consider for those applying.
When you first graduate the Oklahoma City Academy, your pay will be anywhere between $45,000 and $50,000.
Well, I'm glad that they posted it, but yeah, this is pretty average, I believe, in America at this point in time. So it's not terrible as a starting salary, I think, because the median individual income, I believe, in America is around the 50K mark, and I think household is around 80K, maybe somewhere around those figures. And so having 45 to 50K right out of schooling is pretty good overall. But still, with all that stress and responsibility that's with it, that could be, you could likely make the same amount of money doing a number of other jobs. And so I wouldn't expect or see this as particularly high paying, especially for the responsibilities associated with it.
You could range on that pay for up to a year or longer, and that's where it becomes extremely difficult. It depends on the level of facility that you're at for what your pay will be. Most air traffic controllers at very entry-level positions, and then your pay continues to increase throughout your tenure, throughout your seniority. And we have so many young people right now That's why their pay stays on the low end and the need to retain that group.
Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy announced that trainees at the FAA Academy would receive $5 more an hour to help with recruitment. He also posted on X saying 3 years after graduating from the academy, you can make an average of $160,000 a year. In 2023, the Bureau of Labor Statistics said the average annual wage was $137,000 a year.
Okay, that's actually pretty solid. 45 to 50 is actually very, very low for right out of the gate, but maybe there's some type of training program or scenario here where like maybe when you are your first year or two out, you are only like shadowing or being supervised by another individual. So maybe they don't pay as high of a salary for that time frame of sort of training. This makes a lot more sense. Like this seems to be a very healthy salary where somebody would likely want to do this job for this pay. So maybe there's something else backing the reason why that number is so small. Again, I would assume if the starting salary was somewhere closer to like the 75K range, where like it is noticeably above average for an individual, people would probably be flocking to this job, especially in light of the responsibilities. But 45 to 50K seems low when you could likely do a number of other jobs that are far less stressful.
Most air traffic controllers, at least 41% of the facilities are forced on mandatory overtime, meaning they only have 4 days off in an entire month, and they work 60 hours.
Whoa, 4 days off a month? Never mind. I don't know if 130K is enough anymore. This is forced overtime. That sounds really terrible, and 4 days off a month is really, really sad. Arguably, you should be expecting, just from standard weekends, 8 to 10 days off a month. Never mind like vacation time or sick time. So that's where like these people probably are getting 1 weekend a month and then maybe like 1 day vacation or 1 day sick or so is a common scenario for these individuals. So for that kind of pay, that is really bad. And I wonder if they're getting to these high numbers of like 140 to 160K a year based off of overtime pay, which certainly some people would like and choose optionally, but he just stated that it was mandatory. So that seems really rough as a scenario.
Inside that work week.
There are various facilities out there that are working overtime, but there's a lot of facilities that are not. And so we have 313 facilities in the country. Not every facility is as understaffed, so to speak, as some. So it just depends on where you are.
President Trump has alleged without evidence that DEI hiring practices at the FAA were to blame for the fatal collision in D.C. last.
This is true. Trump did blame DEI for the crash before they actually did the investigation. And then he started just like quietly didn't say anything afterwards. He's actually blamed DEI for so many things. Like, I'm not sure how much he thinks DEI is actually happening around the country. I would say, again, at least at this point in time, post-Trump second term starting, DEI is basically like dead. Like, people only talk about it in hushed tones, if at all, nowadays. But even in the peak of the DEI days, in my opinion, like, people would talk a lot and they would say all these huge changes that they're aiming for, like, oh, we're going to double the number of females in this team or the number of people of color or whatever it was. And they'd always talk this big game, but then not actually follow through. At best, what I was seeing is that like people were willing to wait a couple weeks on hiring somebody to see if a higher qualified female or individual of color candidate came through, but they weren't willing to wait that long. And so basically they would just delay maybe a week or two for some standard candidate that they have and then just go with that one. They weren't really going above and beyond and like setting any hard limits from what I've observed at multiple companies. Most of the time it was just, we'll do our best to try to do this, and we'll just mostly keep track with surveys and demographic information. That was really the only big change that I saw, is that I think demographic information was added to things like survey results and for populace within a company. And that's really the biggest difference that I think I saw. Bias training, I think, was pretty solid back in the day. those definitely I don't see anymore. Used to get those like once or twice a year. Now it's been a while. So I'm not sure how much DEI he was seeing, but for myself, I'm really confused as to how much he thinks DEI actually impacted any work environment for it to also, one, have been impactful and noticeable, but two, to actually be such a large detriment that it was like completely crashing certain segments of the economy and or certain types of work or employment. Blows my mind, because DEI was never that big in my opinion. I think maybe if you ask like the DEI representative or like the coordinator for your company, they'll hype it up and say how all this change has happened and how they're doing all this great work and so much change is happening and it's right around the corner. But outside of the hype, I don't think there was actually much of a noticeable difference. Like in the past decade, from maybe 10 years ago, DEI basically not really being referenced at all, to the last few years where it kind of went into overdrive and it was talked about all the time. And so there really wasn't that much of a difference. I think we just changed how we spoke about things and how we discussed things. But real change, in my opinion, was very slow. I think I've seen some numbers reference how there's more people of color and like more women in the job market and in certain companies. And I'm not sure how much DEI can take the credit of that, in my opinion. I think there were a lot of movements in the past decades ago that actually pushed for like women's rights and the rights of Black people and other people of color in America especially. And so it wouldn't be odd to me that as these scenarios and opportunities became more normalized, minority demographics were choosing to enter the workforce more. And so for me, I'm not entirely convinced that DEI made a huge difference. It could just be survivor bias of the change that needed to happen to allow those demographics to grow in the workforce have already happened, and likely we're still ticking up well before the like recent DEI craze. But again, I'm not sure how anyone gets to the point where they would blame DEI for major issues.
Last January.
The bar for becoming air traffic controller has never moved. I've been in since 2005, and the standard that I went through is the same standard that we use today. 70%, again, is passing the academy. We haven't lowered it regardless of your race, nationality, origin. Nothing has changed.
Exactly. I don't think I've ever been at any workplace, and this has been one of those like primary arguments where they seem to almost be referencing, like, I think it was affirmative action, I believe, was one of the past versions of trying to force minority inclusion into certain workforces and other areas. And so I'm actually not sure now that this rhetoric is being used for DEI. I had always been under the impression that affirmative action basically sort of forced lowering the bar. And again, now seeing it happen in real time with DEI, it's possible that it wasn't. So I would say take this with a grain of salt. But I think that's certainly the conception or the argument that some folks have, like Trump included, that we're lowering the bar for individuals of color or minority groups or females or whatever the demographic is that he's upset about. And so that hasn't been the case at any workplace that I've seen. I think at best what I have observed is lowering the mandatory minimum requirements for it. So maybe saying instead of needing 4 years of college, you could have 3 years of college, or, you know, a few certifications or this other thing to kind of reference that maybe you didn't have as much opportunity, but you still have relevant skills. But the actual testing and verification is the exact same for those individuals as people with the standard backgrounds. And same thing for training and expectations for them on the job. And so I certainly have never seen that in practice, but this seems to be the argument that I hear a lot when they reference DEI or some other program, is that like the bar is lowering and then employers are just choosing to have worse employees for some reason, just to like hit a quota or whatever it is that they have in mind, which again, I have not seen to be the case myself. And this individual seems to also be referencing effectively the same thing, which is the bar hasn't lowered at all. The bar is still the same year after year.
Changed in the air traffic world for the hiring of the air traffic controllers.
In 2023, the FAA announced the Enhanced Air Traffic Collegiate Training Initiative, which allows qualified schools to provide equivalent training. The air traffic program at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University was just certified in 2024 and is the fourth school in the program.
I would love to be an en route controller at Atlanta Center. That's the goal, that's the dream.
The school's been around for nearly a century, and it has over 260 students studying air traffic control.
A controller needs to memorize every point on that map and every point on this radar display. So that's the very first thing our students do, and it's the very first thing a trainee would do in the FAA, and that is memorize the map.
Professor McCormick worked in air traffic with the FAA for 33 years. He now runs the air traffic program at Embry-Riddle.
One of the things with air traffic control is that you have to love the challenge. You have to love the complexity, and you have to love the volume, and you have to learn to work as a team in a control tower.
Students must.
So this makes sense, having sort of like an alternative path to employment here, because I can't imagine somebody wanting to, I'm not sure how much the actual schooling is here, but college nowadays can be about $100K a year. And so in certain schools, and so if you're going to go and know that your first year out of school, you're going to make $45K, you likely don't want hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans just to have gotten that job. That's super stressful. If you go through like a alternative program or certification that doesn't require you to take on potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, makes a lot of sense to me. I think they have these types of programs in other fields as well. That could definitely help ramp it up. And I could see individuals, especially from poorer backgrounds, looking at 45K and saying, that's not great, but you know, in a couple of years, I could be making 100K plus. Like, that could be the dream for so many young individuals that don't know how they would be able to get through college or pay for college or have some of those other standard opportunities. So it's actually nice to see that they have programs like this. I think this could be a new trend that occurs, especially with the soaring college prices, is that there's going to be more specialized education and certification that allows you to have alternative paths into the workforce, because I think there's going to have to be eventually a solution for folks who can't keep up with these increasing demands on financial backing for college.
Go through a 4-year bachelorette program that teaches them how the system works. Then they apply the knowledge in a simulated environment.
Air France 1008, turn right heading 240 and climb maintain 12000.
There are different types of towers a controller can work at. To understand, let's take a look at how it works. The National Airspace System, or NAS, is 29 million square miles with more than 45,000 flights each day. A commercial flight traveling from one airport to another can be handed off to many controllers. As a plane pushes back from the gate, a ground controller taxis you to the runway. Then tower control handles the aircraft that are taking off and on final approach, typically from the surface to 2,500 feet and a 5-mile radius of the airport. Then terminal radar approach control, or TRACON controllers, take over until the aircraft is about 18,000 feet and handed off to an en route controller. In the US, there are over 263 air traffic control towers, 146 TRACON, and 21 en route centers.
I feel that tower is a lot more difficult than TRACON. That just comes from it being a little bit more stressful. You're really controlling those aircraft that are in the pattern, that are up in the air, and you want to get them home safe.
In the tower lab, students are in the simulator looking out onto airport runways, clearing aircraft to take off and land. In the room next door, students are acting as pilots flying those planes. Just down the hall is the TRACON lab, where controllers take over communications as planes leave the airport.
TRACON is a little bit easier. You are really focusing on specific rules and minima to keep those aircraft separated.
The number of aircraft any single controller will be handling is going to vary depending upon the geometry of an airport, how many taxiways there are, how many runways there are, and it's going to depend upon how busy an airport is. So during the lower traffic periods, it could be as little as 5. During the peak traffic periods, it could be 30 or 40 or more.
McCormick says that the recent FAA certification has grown interest in the program. After graduation, pending they pass tests like the medical and ATSA exam, these students can now go straight into a job instead of the FAA Academy, where on-the-job training will continue.
It typically takes from 1 to 5 years, depending upon how complex and how busy an air traffic control facility a student would go to in order for them to reach fully certified status.
Another issue the FAA has been dealing with is aging technology.
In many of our facilities, we don't have.
So before they get too far in that, it sounds like maybe that program that they're referencing is instead of, I initially interpreted it as maybe like a couple-year program to be an alternative to college. If I was following through the end there, I think what they are really saying is that they're going to have a 4-year degree that is equivalent to a standard 4-year degree plus training and certification, I think was the difference. So I think the idea is that maybe this helps an individual kind of bypass that initial low pay period and maybe reduce some of that training time, or at least reduce the amount of time that they're in that low pay period. But it sounds like it was still a 4-year program if I was following appropriately. So that still seems like quite a burden. I'm not entirely sure exactly what else is covered in air traffic control for it to require a 4-year full degree. I was kind of assuming this would be something that they could have trained in like a couple of years, but maybe that's where the education portion is maybe a few years and that the training portion is another few years out of that 4. Maybe if any of you are more familiar with this program, feel free to add some comments on how you interpreted this or how you believe this is currently working, but I still think having less time for folks to be potentially underpaid and for their services is better and would be a valid alternative, even if it's maybe not as good as I had initially thought it was going to be.
A standardized level of equipment. Every facility, because of our the long-term funding issues that we've had, it's been very stop and go.
Air traffic control has been around for 90 years. In the early days, there was no radar or radio communications. The first 3 stations opened in 1936 in Newark, New Jersey, Chicago, and Cleveland. The use of radar came along in 1950. Automation arrived in the 1970s, when controllers were able to see an aircraft's identity, altitude, and other data. The Airport and Airway Trust Fund was also established in 1970, which is the primary source of funding of the FAA today. It collects excise taxes on airline tickets and other users of the NAS. In the mid-2000s, the FAA introduced a multi-billion-dollar initiative called the Next Generation Air Transportation System, or NextGen, to modernize the NAS over more than 2 decades.
NextGen was more of an idea encompassing many upgrades to the system. The goal is to fund the system properly, to reform the funding system, and to bring the actual equipment to the controllers that's needed.
Many of these updates were supposed to be implemented by 2025, but the agency has had mixed success in reaching these goals, citing the pandemic as a big cause for the delays.
So our main issues right now are telecommunications. It's a very old and antiquated system running through copper lines. It needs to switch over to some level of fiber optic. Outside of that is then our what we call a notice to airmen system, and that's to give pilots information all around the country and around the world about obstacles or issues near and around airports that are important to them. When they don't have that information, most airplanes can't fly. We've had to shut down the entire aviation system for hours before because that broke. So we need to invest there.
I just think it's some outdated technology that needs updating. And obviously, as you have outdated technology, you're going to have failures, things break over time. And so again, it's just getting things up to where they need to be.
491 Heavy.
One modernization the FAA is starting to roll out is electronic flight data strips. Controllers have used paper strips for decades to keep track of flights. Electronic strips will allow the information to be updated in real time to better handle fluctuations in traffic. The update has started rolling out, but won't be finished or in airports like JFK until 2029.
This system continues to be modernized. It's just not scaled and funded at the level that's needed.
When you talk about modernization, you look at some of the foreign countries and the equipment that they have compared to what continues to be talked about the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the equipment we have. One, look at the size in comparison to where we are versus them. And then obviously we have a different process here in the United States on how we procure this equipment and how we get the equipment in. So there's a lot of differences, but we're still the safest ANSP in the world.
The simulators we saw at Embry-Riddle were brand new, and experts say that new technology cuts down the required training time.
Not everything we have is 1950s technology. It's not. Matter of fact, our TSS is our tower simulations that we just rolled out in 95 different facilities around the country. That is 2021 technology that we're using. State-of-the-art simulation. I mean, you know, it's high definition.
The FAA also said that AI could be used in moving the technology forward.
I absolutely think we'll embrace AI. And I don't want to say in the control tower that we're going to use AI to start controlling airplanes, but when we look at some of the technology for training, I think AI absolutely will be a component. We use it on the admin side all the time for various things. I mean, that's how we get reports pretty fast and, you know, analyze data, we use AI.
The FAA recently started testing Elon Musk's Starlink terminals at several facilities around the country as part of the solution. The FAA doesn't expect to have sufficient ATC staffing for 5 to 7 years.
Under Secretary Duffy's leadership, we put out a surge call, and we've had over 10,000 applications for the positions themselves. About 7,500 of those have been referred for testing. So, you know, obviously our focus is to get controllers, the best and the brightest, into the academy and get them out to the facilities as soon as possible.
Insufficient staffing coupled with lack of new technology will continue to challenge its efforts to keep up with flight demand.
Traffic is up and traffic continues to climb. Well, with that, you're going to have more complexity, more volume in the different areas. So it's going to take more folks to do that.
If you like to tell people what to do and they have to listen to you, it's an ideal person for an air traffic controller.
As the airspace gets more crowded and new technology becomes available, some wonder if technology could replace air traffic controllers altogether.
The key is the controller. Technology may change, aircraft performance may change, but what doesn't change is the professionalism and the excellent service that air traffic controllers provide.
Number 5185, Air Center, descend and maintain 13,000. Jack.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.